listeners, and welcome to the first ever Insomnia Podcast. I'm your host, Leo, and tonight we'll be taking you on a tour of some of my personal favorite stories from the r/NoSleep subreddit, as well as some of the top stories from r/Paranormal. So without further ado, let's begin with our first story. Make sure to keep me updated on my volume, as this is my first live stream on the platform, so I still have a little bit to figure out. It's official. I'm an old man. For the last couple of years, I've comforted myself by saying I'm in my early 70s. But math is simple and unforgiving. Today is my 75th birthday, and God, the years do fly. I'm not here for your well wishes. This is hardly a milestone I'm excited about. I'm glad to still be here, of course, but I find I have less and less to live for with every passing year. My bones ache. My kids live far away. And the other side of my bed has been empty for just over 8 months now. In fact, once I cast my vote against that goddamn Trump this November, I may have nothing to live for at all. So spare me your happy birthdays and your congratulations, if you please. I'm here because I have a story for you, and it's one I've never told before. I used to think I kept it inside because it was silly, or maybe because nobody would believe it. I've found, though, that the older you grow, the more exhausting it becomes to lie to yourself. If I'm being perfectly honest, I've never told anybody this story because it scares me almost to death. But death seems friendlier than it used to. So listen close. The year was 1950. The setting, a small town in Maine. I was a boy of 9. Rather small for my age, with only one friend in the world to speak of. And his family, seemingly on a whim, decided to move 2,000 miles away. It was shaping up to be the worst summer of my life. My pop wasn't around, and my mom was a chore whore. Boy, I was proud of myself when I came up with that one. So I wasn't apt to hang around the house. With some hesitation, I decided the public library was the place to be that summer. The library's collection of books, particularly children's books, was meager to say the least. But within the walls of that miserly structure, I would find no undone chores, no nagging mother, God rest her soul. And perhaps, most importantly, no other children with whom I would be expected to associate. I was the only kid with a low enough social status to spend his precious days of freedom sulking amid the bookshelves, and that was just fine with me. The first half of my summer was even more dreadful than I had imagined it would be. I would sleep until 10, do my chores, then ride my bike to the library. And by bike, I mean a rusty log of shit attached to a pair of wheels. Once there, I would split my time between unintentionally annoying the elderly patrons and deliberately doing so. One pleasant lady actually interrupted my incessant tongue-clicking to hiss a "shut the fuck up" at me. It was the first time I'd ever heard a grown-up use the F word. Big fucking deal, I know. But in those days, it was unheard of. The dreary days turned into woeful weeks. I had actually begun praying for school to start again, until I discovered the basement. I could have sworn I had roamed every inch of that library. But one day, in the far corner, behind the foreign language collection, I stumbled across a small wooden door I had never seen before. That was where it all began. The door was windowless and made from oak that looked far older than the wall in which it rested. It had a knob of black metal that quite literally looked ancient. I wouldn't have been surprised to learn it was crafted in the 17th century. Engraved on the knob was what appeared to be a single footprint. I had the sense that whatever lay beyond this door was forbidden to me, and therefore, probably the most interesting thing I would encounter all summer. I quickly glanced around to make sure nobody was watching me. Then, I turned the heavy knob, slipped behind the door, and shut it. There was nothing. Only darkness. I took a couple of steps, and then stopped, unnerved by the totality of the shadow which surrounded me. I waved my hands in front of me in an attempt to find a wall or a shelf or anything to hold on to. What I actually found was far more subtle. A small string dangling from above, but far more useful. I grabbed it firmly and pulled it down. Back in the day, lots of light bulbs were operated with strings, and this was one of them. My surroundings were instantly illuminated. I was standing on a small dusty platform that looked as though it hadn't seen life in quite some time. To my left was a crickety-ass spiral staircase, made of wood and appearing ready to collapse at any second. The bulb was the only source of light in the room, and it was feeble. So when I peered over the railing to see what lay below, the bottom of the staircase dissolved into darkness. I was beginning to feel scared. This place, wherever I was, seemed to have no business in a town library. It was as though I was in a completely different building. But no 9-year-old likes to let a mystery go unsolved. Looking back, I wish I could tell my prepubescent self to turn around, to go back, to do anything else besides descending that staircase. You'll be spared lots of sleepless nights, I would say. But of course, I didn't know that then. I may not have listened, even if I had. So instead of turning back, I took a deep breath, I gripped the railing, and I glared resolutely forward as I began my descent. The wood on the railing was dry and covered with splinters. I immediately let go, holding my hands out for balance as I carefully traversed the staircase. It was, or at least seemed, very long. And with only the dim glow from the string bulb far above me, my heart pounded mercilessly in the darkness. Even kids can sense when something isn't right. At least I think so. The problem is, they just don't always give a shit. By the time my feet reached the cement floor at the bottom, the light from the bulb above was nearly a memory. There was a new light source, and God, I'll never forget it. Directly in front of me was a door, massive and a deep shade of red. The light was coming from behind the door, and it shone out in thin lines from all four sides. A sinister, dimly glowing rectangle. For the second time, I took a deep breath, and I went through a door that I shouldn't have. In contrast to the dank room I entered from, the room behind the door was blinding. When my eyes adjusted, what I saw nearly took my breath away. It was a library. The most perfect library imaginable. I gaped in wonder as I stepped, almost reverently, further into the room. It was beautiful. It was smaller than the library above, much smaller. But it seemed to be almost tailor-made for me. The shelves were packed with brightly colored titles. Both armchairs in the middle of the room were exquisitely comfortable, and the smell, my God, the smell, was simply unbelievable. Sort of a mixture of citrus and pine. I simply can't do it justice with words. So I'll suffice it to say I've never smelled anything better. Not in my 75 years. What was this room? And why had I never heard of it before? Why was no one else here? Those were the questions that I should have been asking. But I was intoxicated. As I gazed around at all the books and basked of the smell of paradise, I could only form one thought. I will never be bored again. In truth, boredom only hid from me for 3 years. It was on my 12th birthday, 63 years ago to this day, that everything changed. Before that day, I visited my basement sanctuary as often as I could, usually several times a week. I never saw another soul down there, yet strangely I remained free of suspicion. I never removed a book from that room, but instead would pick up a particular volume wherever I had stopped reading during my previous visit. I sat, always in the same deep purple armchair, and always leaving its twin barren and directly across from myself. That armchair was mine. The other was... well, I suppose I couldn't have articulated it much better than I can now. But it wasn't mine. That's for damn sure. On my 12th birthday, I arrived later than usual. My mom had invited a couple of classmates and some cousins over to our house to celebrate. A gesture which I found more tedious than touching. Really, I just wanted to spend my birthday sitting and reading and smelling paradise. Eventually, our guests went home. I made it to the library about 15 minutes before closing time. That didn't matter. The workers never checked down there before they locked up. I was free to stay as late as I wished. That particular night, I was devouring the final chapters of an epic adventure. Knights, swords, dragons, and the like. I didn't smell it until I read the final words and closed the book. The once exquisite aroma of that room had turned sour. I sat for a moment, unsettled. Objectively, I could recognize that the smell was actually the same it had been before. That mixture of citrus and pine. I just perceived it differently, and I didn't like it anymore. It was the nasal version of an optical illusion. You know, the one that looks like a young woman glancing backward, but all of a sudden you see that it's really an old woman facing towards you. You can't unsee that, and I couldn't unsmell this. The spell was broken. The odor also seemed, for the first time, to be coming from somewhere specific. With a fair amount of trepidation, I stalked around the room, sniffing the air like a crazed canine, until I came to a shelf near the back. The shelf was perfectly normal, with the exception of one title, a large, leather-bound cover of solid faded maroon, with one striking black footprint at the top of the spine. A large leather-bound cover. This was the source of the smell. I opened that front cover, and I saw one sentence scrawled neatly in blood-red ink atop the first page. Rest your sorrows down, friend, and leave them where they lie. I stared at this sentence, mesmerized. As I began to retreat to my chair, I turned a page. Blank. The smell became stronger. Another page. Blank. And the smell grew stronger still. I stopped for a moment, suppressed a gag, and continued walking. Then, as I neared the armchairs, I turned one final page. And there, in the same sinister print, was the last thing I expected to see. My own name. I dropped the book. I began to sprint toward the door, but as I shifted my gaze forward, my heart leapt to my throat, and I stopped in my tracks. The empty chair wasn't empty anymore. An aged man in a suit sat before me. One leg crossed over the other, contemplating me with piercing gray eyes and a light smirk. I fell to my knees, and I expelled the contents of my stomach onto the carpet. I wiped my mouth, staring at my vomit, when I heard the man let out a chuckle. I stared at him disbelievingly. "Who are you?" I asked, panic in my voice. The man leapt to his feet, grabbed me gently by the shoulders, and helped me to my chair. He sat once again in his own. "I fear we've got off to a bad start," he said, glancing at the pile of sick on the carpet. "The smell, it does take some getting used to." "Who are you?" I repeated. "Tonight, you will know hardship like you've never known before," he said. "I come as a friend, offering you refuge from it, and from all other storms which lie ahead." I wanted nothing more than to leave at that moment, but I remained seated. I asked him what he was talking about. "Your mother is dead, my boy, by her own hand in her own kitchen. The scene is gruesome, I must admit." He said this in sorrowful tones, but there was a playful glint in his eye. "Surely you wish to avoid this path. I can show you a safer one. My blood ran cold at the horrors this man spoke of, but I did not believe him. "What do you want with me?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. He laughed, an old raspy yelp that seemed to shake him to his bones. "Nothing but your friendship, dear boy," he said. Then, sensing I found his answer inadequate, he expounded. "I want you to come on a journey with me. My work is noble, and you will make a fine apprentice. And maybe, when I'm done..." He sighed tiredly, running his bony fingers through his thin white hair. "Maybe then my work can be yours." I stood up, shuffling towards the door but never breaking his gaze. "You're crazy," I told him. "My mom isn't dead. She's not." "See for yourself if you must," he said, gesturing towards the doorknob. I threw him a contemptuous glare and bolted for the exit. As my hand closed around the knob, he said my name softly. In spite of myself, I turned around. "Your road won't be easy, friend. If it ever becomes too much for you, and I mean ever," he said, pausing to sweep his hand over the room. "You know where to find me." I slammed the door behind me and I took the decrepit stairs two at a time. I exited the library, clambered onto my bike, and hightailed it home. The front door was wide open. I dismounted, leaving my bike in a heap on the ground, and approached the house cautiously. The old man was lying. He must have been. Still, tears began to sting my eyes. Heart pounding, I stepped inside and called for my mother. I heard no answer, so I turned to the kitchen. To this day, I don't know why she did it. I lived in that small town in Maine my entire life, although I've kept mostly clear of the public. Library. Once in my late 20s, I summoned the courage to step inside. Life was good at that time, and my fear had begun to morph into idle curiosity. Where the door to my basement sanctuary once stood was only a blank wall. I asked the librarian what had become of the basement, though in my heart, I knew the answer. There was no basement, she said. There had never been a basement. In fact, if she had her facts correct, city zoning ordinances prohibited a basement in the area. I had been haunted by that sickly sweet smell, that poisonous blend of citrus and pine, ever since that long ago birthday. When I saw my mother in the kitchen that day, collapsed in a pool of her own blood, I smelled it. When a man claiming to be my father knocked on my college apartment door, begged me for money, and beat me to within an inch of my life when I refused, I smelled it. When my wife miscarried our second child, I smelled it, and again when she miscarried our fourth. When our oldest son got behind the wheel of the family Buick, completely shit-faced, and got his girlfriend killed, I smelled it. I began to smell it periodically as my wife became sick. She died late last year. And now, I'm alone. For the first time in more than half a century. Now, I smell it every day. And it feels like an invitation. A few months ago, I went back to the library and the small oak door with the ancient handle It was right there. Right where it used to be. My evening walk has brought me past that library every day since, but I haven't gone inside. Maybe tonight I will. I'm frightened to die, yes. But lately, I'm even more frightened to keep living. The old man was right. My road hasn't been easy, and I doubt it will get any easier. Rest your sorrows down, friend, and leave them where they lie. He promised relief, a refuge, he said. Was he right about that too? There's only one way to find out. After all, I still know where to find him. Dragon Myth, I apologize. I was not looking at the chat during the story, and I don't like to stop in the middle of the story. But no, this is not pre-recorded. I am reading this live. Thank you, those of you who are watching, and those of you who will watch in the future. I appreciate all of you being here. That was our first story, and I hope you enjoyed it. Next, we're going to go to one of my favorite NoSleep stories. This one is called The Showers. Just a reminder before we start our next story. I now have my own subreddit called r/sleepless_nights. It's fairly new, with very few members in it at the moment, as I've just acquired it from another friend that I've met through my excursion to find my own subreddit. However, if you have any stories, art, music, or anything else that you would like to see on this channel, please feel free to post it there. Without further ado, here's the next story. Every area in all parts of the world has those area-specific urban legends that just refuse to die. Whether the stories are about a haunted asylum on the outskirts of a city, the creature that lives in the nearby woods, or a ghost that haunts the lonely stretch of road outside of town, there's always a common thread within the tales. No one has ever been to these places, seen the creatures, or witnessed any hauntings with their own eyes. There are members of every generation who will proclaim they know someone whose brother's best friend's sister went to that haunted house with 13 floors that used real blood and snakes and spiders, and is so scary that no one has ever made it all the way through. Those same people will swear by these stories without ever being able to provide a shred of evidence or a name of someone who could provide proof of the claim, simply because, well, everyone around here knows that it's a true story. The storytellers eventually pass the tales on to their children, who modify them just enough to keep up with the changing times, and the cycle continues. I'm as skeptical as anyone when it comes to these stories, seeing as I was like a junkie when I was younger, constantly searching for more terrifying stories about whatever area of the country I was living in at the time. I made up and spread stories about haunted pizza parlors in New York, my cousin's encounter with the Jersey Devil, or how my grandfather encountered a feral human-like demon in the woods of Colorado. I even broke the one rule with these stories by putting myself in them. This took guts, in hindsight, because I had to make sure I always told them in the same way. Surprisingly, no one ever called my bluff. I like to think that I have some wonderful contributions to various urban legends around the Midwest and northeastern states. I moved around a lot. There was always a surge of joy whenever I would wander the halls at school and hear one of my classmates retelling my stories to another one of their friends, adding little bits here and there, like a massive game of telephone. I knew, of course, that the stories were complete fiction, but I stood my ground. Whenever someone asked me about them, I would even manage to act a little bit, speaking with a shaky voice or looking scared when I would recount a situation that I had supposedly experienced myself. I suppose this aspect of my childhood has led to my current predicament, which I will recount in full for the internet to take from it what they will. I have laid this little introduction out as a sort of disclaimer, aimed particularly at those who will call my story into question. I have been like the boy who cried wolf for years, but I assure you with every ounce of my honesty and integrity that I have at this time, this wolf is real. From my introduction, it's probably apparent that I moved around the country quite a bit in my middle and high school years. Neither of my parents had anything to do with any branch of the armed forces. They simply didn't tend to hang around any given place for too long. I suppose it had some sort of effect on me. I wasn't hurt by it or anything of the sort. Growing up, I was a complete ham. I made friends very easily, was often the class clown, and because of that, was often disliked by my teachers. Again, this was never an issue, as I was usually in another state by the time the next semester rolled around. My friendships were often fleeting, as were any positive relationships I ever had with my teachers. Because of the events that followed, my memory of one teacher in particular is probably slightly skewed. But I will attempt to give the least biased version of our friendship that I can. Mr. Mays was one of my social studies teachers in the early years of my high school experience. Being older now, I can understand how horrible children are to deal with around that age, and I respect him to no ends for the way that he was able to connect with his students. He seemed like one of us, talked like one of us, made pop culture references that were current, listened to cool music, and sometimes he would even say hell or damn while he was giving a passionate lecture about Native American history or something like that. A teacher that swore, even a little bit, was the epitome of cool to a high school freshman. My memories of Mr. Mays mostly stem from the way he really got into anything he was doing. The instance that's still very vivid in my mind, of course, was around Halloween of my sophomore year. Mr. Mays has the typical teacher decorations around the classroom. Smiling jack-o'-lanterns and black cat cartoons. Typical and boring in the minds of egotistic high school students. However, on the 31st of October, when most other teachers were rolling their eyes at the fact teenagers still took dressing up in costumes on Halloween seriously, Mr. Mays took the whole cool teacher thing to a new level. We walked into the classroom, and we were surprised to find the blinds drawn, sheets over the smaller windows, candles lighting the room, and a single, frowning jack-o'-lantern sitting on a stool in front of the desks. Mr. Mays sat at his desk, just watching the students come into class and take their seats. He didn't have to ask anyone to be quiet, because the moment everyone walked into the room, they were either too excited to care about petty conversations or too confused to bother with them. The students took their seats as Mr. Mays began his lecture. He spoke quietly to set the mood and took a seat on a chair right next to the jack-o'-lantern in the center of the room. "Today is probably my favorite day of the year, class," he said in a monotonous voice. "Halloween is my favorite holiday. And I want to share with you exactly why I love it so much." One girl raised her hand with a concerned look on her face. "I'm pushing the due date for your papers to next Tuesday," said Mr. Mays without bothering to look at the girl, who slowly put her hand down, looking around at the other students with a hint of embarrassment. The class erupted in quiet cheers, and Mr. Mays waited for the inevitable silence. He began his story as soon as the class had calmed down. I will attempt to recreate the amazing story that Mr. Mays told the class that day. The way in which he told this story rendered the horror junkies speechless and the rest of the class terrified. The same girl that had raised her hand to ask about the paper was holding her knees to her chest by the end of it, a look of terror on her face. The important thing to know was what the story was about. The specifics slip my mind now, and they aren't too relevant. I'll try to recount the parts of the story that matter most, but don't hold me to it. Basically, Mr. Mays and his friends set out on a road trip around the country right after graduating from college. They took a truck, loaded it with camping gear, and set out to sightsee for the entire summer. The group went from the Poconos in New Jersey down to the coasts of Florida, New Orleans, to California, and up to Washington. From there, they went to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and then back home to New York. This concept of the freedom to travel anywhere had the entire class hooked in an instant. Mr. Mays was the coolest teacher ever, in my eyes. Being adventurous college kids, the group didn't bring a map. There were no time constraints, so they just kind of drove in the general direction they wanted to go, and eventually found a town to stay in, or some place that looked interesting. He told us that after spending a week in Colorado, he and his friends had to travel through miles and miles of corn, plains, and more corn. He assumed they were either in Nebraska or Kansas when they decided to pool their extra cash and stay in a hotel for the night. They settled into a motel in some town that Mr. Mays could barely remember the name of, when one of his friends realized they were somewhere near his grandfather's farm. He wasn't entirely sure where it was, but being adventurous college kids, they decided to get a quick refund from the motel and try and contact the friend's grandpa. They were unable to get a hold of the grandpa on the phone, so the group figured it would be fun to just show up. Mr. May's friend was adamant that his grandparents would take them in and feed them without a moment of hesitation, so the group set out with an hour of sunlight, seeking the salvation of a comfortable house to stay in. In Kansas, or Nebraska, wherever it may have been, there aren't a whole lot of natural markers that could guide lost travelers. Any direction given to someone who didn't live around the area basically amounted to go up a couple of miles to the corn, take a right, and go down a dirt road to the other corn. There should be some wheat on your right. So as is the case in most scary stories, the group got lost. Never wanting to admit defeat, they drove into the night, making wrong turns every 5 minutes, until they found themselves on a wooded road that Mr. May's friend was certain that his grandparents live off of. Mr. Mays described the road as basically a dark path to hell. I wasn't entirely how true this was, because he got very excited and a bit ridiculous with his explanations of the trees that almost tried to grab the car, and the red eyes of countless animals looking at them from the darkness. Regardless, the typical horror tropes worked on most of the class. Everyone was terrified. So the group of guys drove on this dark road for about 15 minutes, before they came to a clearing and a small building with lights in it, and what seemed to be a silo. They figured that, at the very least, the people who lived here would be able to help them find where the guy's grandparents lived. The whole idea of everyone knows everyone in these hick parts of the country fueled his hope. They pulled the car up near the building, realizing they were out of the car, that it happened to be like the kind of places where one would store a whole bunch of chickens, not a home. Still, the lights were on, so they figured they would give it a try. They approached the building as a group, looking in the semi-open sliding door, to find a big empty room. Hanging fluorescent lights lit the room like it was daytime, and they couldn't see a soul. There were no cars, but one of Mr. May's friends was convinced that he'd seen someone as they pulled up. So they decided to go inside and see if there was an office or something where someone might still be working. Why else would they have this huge place lit up like that? There were no doors on the inside of the building. Again, it was just a giant, empty hall. So the group roamed around the property and over towards the silo. As they got closer, they noticed what appeared to be a cellar door. At this point, I remember Mr. Mays telling the entire class to learn from his idiocy. He told us that he hadn't seen many horror movies before that time, so he didn't think twice about approaching a very creepy cellar door in the middle of a dark, scary, foreign place. He said that approaching that door was one of his biggest regrets. Mr. Mays let the whole class know that he was going to tell us as much as he deemed appropriate about the experience. He felt that we were mature enough to handle it, but advised anyone that was squeamish to leave class early. Several students quietly gathered their things and walked out the door, a couple of them being stoners who saw this as an opportunity to smoke behind the school before their next class. I didn't even give the announcement a second thought. Like I said, I was and am a sucker for this kind of stuff, and Mr. Mays was telling a story better than anything I had ever conjured up. Oops. I apologize, that was an alarm. I thought I had silenced that. I will be sure to cut that out when I go back through and edit this. I wanted to learn from this guy, even though I didn't believe much of the story. After the class had thinned a bit, Mr. Mays continued with the story. He told the remaining few that he and his friends opened that cellar door, releasing a smell that he only described as the most putrid thing my senses have ever experienced. The group was no longer concerned with finding the owners of the property, but was now set on finding the source of that smell. They went down the steps into the cellar, which was lit by single bulbs, spaced sporadically along the ceiling of a long hallway. No one spoke. Things had gotten too strange. The walls were lined with metal sheeting, similar to the roofing on farms. The hallway itself was crooked, and the ceilings constantly lowered and rose. like a tunnel that was hastily dug and then never touched up. There were sections where the boys had to almost crouch in order to pass. The worst part, Mr. Mays told us, was that the light bulbs continuously flickered, sometimes acting like a strobe light, making it very difficult to move through the winding and unstable hallways. In hindsight, he was certain that his mind was playing tricks on him, but he remembered seeing flashes of things that couldn't be there. He said when you're that focused on something, or if you're that nervous, your mind can do that to you. It can simply revolt, showing you things or people that aren't there. He continued to describe the hallway, and I was on the edge of my seat. The halls were windy and seemed to go on forever. Mr. Mays guessed that they were somewhere under the creepy forest they had driven through when they found a door, but he couldn't be sure. He said they came upon a door after walking for what felt like a mile. It was simple and wooden, but it looked like it belonged outside of a suburban home. It had a nice design, seemed to be freshly painted red and have a very nice knob and a knocker on it. It was a door that belonged at the entrance to a nice house, not one that would be sitting in a dirt tunnel in the middle of nowhere. His friend walked towards the door, moving carefully because of the flashing bulb and increasingly uncertainly about the stability of the surrounding walls. He turned to the group, the rest of which were nervous at the very least, and attempted to lighten the mood with a laugh before he said, "I should probably knock first." Mr. May's friend grabbed the steel knocker and hit it against the door several times, mockingly, but quietly uttering, "Is anyone home?" The group waited about 30 seconds before the tension broke. The guy next to the door shrugged his shoulders and went to walk back to his friends. But as he did, the light bulb between them surged and exploded. The boys shielded their eyes and looked back to their lone friend by the door. As he lowered his hands, one of the metal sheets of the makeshift roof dropped. The edge of the sheet fell directly on the boy's forehead, slicing it open and sending a wave of blood down his face. The impact apparently knocked him out. He fell back against the door, knocking it open in the process. The entirety of the group rushed through the dim light to their friend, barely noticing the seemingly pitch-black room that now lay before them. Mr. Mays was the first to make it to his friend's side. He lifted the guy's head into his arms, immediately taking off his jacket and putting it over his forehead to attempt to stop the bleeding. Once the group had calmed down, Mr. Mays noticed the arm that had been bracing his friend's head was soaking wet. He was confused about this and was attempting to sort it out when one of his friends started talking. He said something along the lines of, "The lights, we have to go," when Mr. Mays took notice. "You know when you turn off a light," he told the class, "and everything is almost pitch black except for the light of the bulb dying out or cooling down? It was like that, but there were so many of them. At least 20 light bulbs had lit the room seconds ago, and now it only looked like little stars in the darkness. That was definitely terrifying, but it wasn't the scariest thing. There was still a very dim light coming from the hallway behind them, and though it was weak, it lit up the room just enough to see the shape of tens of people standing less than 10 feet in front of them. Mr. May's friend went to say something else, but as one of the bulbs to their right flickered to life, let me interrupt at this point and say that Mr. Mays was generally a playful guy. He had that tone of voice that makes you want to respond. Basically, he could say, "Let's go jump off of a cliff, guys." And he would want to respond with, "All right, Mr. Mays, show us the way." That's a ridiculous statement, but it gets the point across. He was a charismatic guy. The whole story up until this point had been told like a campfire story. He had the voice inflections of someone attempting to be mysterious and scary, which worked, but was noticeable. At this point in his tale, I recall that changing completely. He was no longer attempting to spook anyone. I could tell this section was difficult for him. Either he was a very good actor, or this was a really terrifying memory for him to relive. He told us that the light bulb came to life and illuminated a group of people in front of him. In the dim light, he could see children. At least 20 of them. In just the visible light. They were all dressed in nightgowns that looked to be tattered and torn, stained dark with something. Their hair was long. Every single one of them looked like they had not had a haircut since birth. Some of the children were almost completely obscured by the length of it. Every single one of them didn't appear to have seen a shower or a nice bath in their entire life. Mr. Mays told us that the most terrifying part of the whole thing was that none of the children were moving. They were all standing, staring. Most of them only visible from the fainting light reflecting off of their eyes. His whole group was paralyzed with fear for several seconds when they heard what sounded like an animal in the distance, yelping. One second. The way it was described was like the sound of a dog crying, multiplied by 10. This spurred the group to life. Just as the children began to step forward, his friends grabbed the injured one and lifted him out of the room and into the hallway in an instant. Mays took another second to move and had the difficulty finding his bearings. He reached to his left in an attempt to find a wall to lean against, and ended up finding a handle, then pulled hard, never losing his vision of the children. He bolted for the door right as he noticed what he had grabbed onto. A shower head protruded from a cement wall, reaching maybe a foot into the room. There was something leaking from it, but it was too dim to tell what it was. He realized it had been leaking onto him, but he didn't care. There were now children stammering towards him as an animal cried in the distance, and his friend was seriously injured. As he left the room, he made a point to emphasize that he could make out several more shower heads on the wall near the single, dim-lit bulb. "This is why I call them the showers," Mr. Mays told the class. I was transfixed, sitting as far forward as my desk would allow, bracing for more. "I slammed the red door behind me," he said, "and I ran through that hallway faster than I've ever run before or since. I made it back to the car, and we drove out of there like a bat out of hell." A couple of students snickered at his use of the word hell. "So when you're out trick-or-treating tonight, make sure that you know exactly where you're headed. And don't go out to any abandoned farmhouses. I mean, there aren't many around here, but you're all smart kids. Except Jerry." The class laughed and the mood lightened as the bell rang for passing period. Mr. Mays turned the lights on and thanked everyone for listening, reminded them about the paper due next week, and told us to have a safe and happy Halloween. Students all around me were abuzz with theories about what the story they had just heard. "I bet it was some sort of crazy Nazi hideout," said one girl. "I think they were all ghost babies that were killed by a dog," said another. I couldn't theorize in the slightest. I was still caught up in the moment. The way Mr. Mays had told that story and the detail he included in it, well, it left me feeling like we didn't get the whole story. A couple days later, I stayed after class and I asked him how it really ended and what happened to his friend. He laughed and said that his friend was fine, and that it was honestly, and he whispered this part, probably due to some of the drugs they were on at the time. Mr. Mays winked at me as if to say, "Don't tell anyone about the drugs bit, kid," and I smiled and left. I lived in that town for another couple months, and then I was rapidly moved halfway across the country to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I twisted this story around and told it around campfires as I got older. It was always a hit, but I always changed the ending. Letting the friend die of blood loss or from being dragged away by the children. It wasn't until I got to college that I had a chance to talk to Mr. Mays again. I went to college in northern New York, not for any reason associated with this story. College was a fun time for me, and I continued being the same ham that I'd always been. It wasn't until sometime around my junior year that I ran into Mr. Mays at a bar I frequented. Initially, I couldn't be sure that the person I saw laying with his head buried in his arm at the bar was Mr. Mays. The only trait that grabbed my attention was the sweater that he used to wear on his birthday during class. It simply read, "I'm the birthday boy." I told my group of friends to grab a table and that I would join them in a second. Then I walked over to the man at the bar. "Mr. Mays?" I said, and the man looked up. The man took a second to look at my face before he smiled, put a hand on my shoulder, and said, "Hey there, son. How you been?" I could smell some of the strong whiskey on his breath, and his cheeks were flushed. The look in his eyes told me that he was 3 sheets to the wind and probably had no idea who I was. "Mr. Mays, it's Jack. I was a student of yours for a couple of semesters, about 6 or so years ago." His face changed a bit, and a genuine look of recognition set in. He took a calmer tone, smiled, and said, "How have you been, Jack?" We talked for a solid 20 minutes. I told him what I'd been doing for the last several years, and he told me. Apparently, he was still teaching at the same school, doing the same old shtick, as he called it. I asked if everything was all right, and he said they were as good as they've ever been or were ever going to get. It took me a while to realize that I was an adult, having a conversation with another adult. Every time I had spoken to Mr. Mays previously, I had been in the student-teacher relationship. But now, I was just a guy having a drink with his friend at the bar. My friends eventually left, and I continued to drink with Mr. Mays. He told me all about his divorce, his kids, things I never would have asked or cared about previously. But now, I cared. He was a real person to me, not just an idol anymore. This was a guy who had real problems, not the infallible teacher I once thought he was. It had been several hours before I even brought up his story about the showers. I told him all about my history with urban legends and scary stories, and he just laughed. When I mentioned the story he told us years ago, he almost seemed uncomfortable. He finished his whiskey, signaled for another, and then turned to me and got very serious. Listen, Jack, I don't know why I kept telling that story year after year. His words were slurred, or my hearing was messed up. We were both sufficiently blitzed at this point. That was what my therapist told me to do when I was younger. I had to tell people it, to come to grips with it or some shit. He took a big swig of his drink. Wait, your therapist? Mr. Mays laughed heartily and looked at me. Of course, Jack. You think that something like that wouldn't fuck a person up? I was confused, but I smiled nonetheless. Things had just gotten very strange. But I mean, you said you were all on drugs or something, right? No one was too terribly hurt? You were all okay, right? He got almost cartoonish with his sadness in the next several seconds. Of course we didn't, Jack. Why do you think I'm here right now? I was puzzled, quickly filled with 1,000 questions I wanted to ask him, but I let him carry on. Tim, he didn't make it, Jack. He laughed. His laugh suddenly turned to tears. Fucking took him, they did. I don't even know. The cops told us we were just drunk, that he wandered off and got taken by the wildlife. He didn't know. He didn't see it, Jack. I was absolutely stone-faced at this point. Mr. Mays was carrying along like I knew the actual story, but I didn't. His friend disappeared. I didn't know. I wish they'd have found the body, though. Then we could have shown them. He sighed. That's a bad place, Jack. I don't know anything else to say. It's a bad place. He carried on for a couple of minutes more about his friend and the fun they had before they went on that trip. I let him talk. It was only a few minutes later that his phone rang. Hello, sweetheart, he whispered into the phone. I'll be out in a second. The person on the other end hung up the phone. Mr. Mays got up to leave. It's been nice seeing you, Jackie. You've got a good head on your shoulders, boy. Make sure you use it. He began to walk out of the bar. Mr. Mays, I yelled after him. Yeah, Jack? He turned back towards me. Where'd you say all that shower business took place? Where? Hell. Didn't I mention it? It's somewhere outside of Broken Bow, Nebraska. Fucking hell on earth, if you ask me. Mr. Mays walked out of the bar after waving to me, running into the wall before eventually finding the door. That was the last time I'd see him. I'd never be able to tell him the impact he had on my life, or rather, the impact his story had on me. He'd never know about the trip we took after graduation, almost mimicking the ones he and his friends had made. He would never know that the things he saw at that place were real. Why? Well, he died about a month later. His liver failed on him. It's alright, though, because his family was with him in the hospital room. He got to die around people that cared about him, and that's all I can ask for a man like that. I experienced that place too, several years later. That's where my story turns. The following is the story of how I came to find the showers, and why I will never, ever go anywhere near Nebraska ever again. I'll finish this story when I'm sober. The memory is clear enough. Oh, my battery came unplugged. Give me 1 second, guys. I'm gonna get a little couple of things set up here before we switch to the second half of this story. I hope you're enjoying it so far. There we go. Just a reminder to all of you before we go on with the second part of the story. Just remember that if you enjoy my videos and if you enjoy this podcast, please make sure to subscribe so you never miss out on another video, podcast, live stream, or anything else that I would post to this channel. Also, if you'd like to get involved in my community, whether it be posting stories that you'd like me to read, posting scary art that you've made, scary music, or anything of the sort that you would like me to see, please feel free to go check out r/sleepless_nights. That is, again, r/sleepless_nights on Reddit. It's my own new official subreddit, and I'm excited to see the community we build with it. Without further ado, we're going to move on to part 2. I'm awake now, semi-sober, and ready to finish this for you guys. The internet and whoever cares to hear it. I didn't find out that Mr. Mays had passed away until a couple of months after the funeral service. Initially, I was going to seek out his family in order to send my condolences. But it wasn't as if Mr. Mays and I were best friends or anything, so I refrained. I continued through my college career, and I graduated a year or so after our bar meeting. Graduating with English as my major wasn't a mistake, but it wasn't exactly something that landed me any sort of immediate jobs after college. Now, I had saved a pretty solid amount of money when I was in school, and decided I deserved a bit of a vacation, if you will. I took my spare cash, got it together with my college buddy Steve, packed up, and hit the road, aiming for somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. I'd lived near Littleton, Colorado when I was younger, and remembered loving the area, so this destination was as good as any. The trip was a success. We made it somewhere around Estes Park, Colorado, and found a cheap cabin that we rented out for about a month. The days were filled with lounging, hiking, and generally things that involved little to no work on our parts. After our rental was through, we packed up again and headed our way back east. Sometime during this trip, we had met up with a couple of Estes Park natives in one of the local bars. We never typically hung out with them or anything like that. We just had conversations now and then over drinks and food. One night, these guys were paying their tab and packing up to leave awfully early. They were usually there until the wee hours of the morning. When we questioned them about it, they told us they were headed to a little get-together with some friends of theirs, and invited us. Having nothing else to do, we hopped in the car and followed them to the party. The party itself was very low-key, and ultimately inconsequential to the story. However, the important thing about it was that at some point in the night, we were all sitting around the fire and swapping ghost stories. At this point in my life, I wasn't as much of a ham as I was in my younger years, but with a little bit of encouragement, I started on a couple of stories I remembered telling in my youth. Eventually, I made it to Mr. May's story about the showers. Every time that I had told it after hearing it from Mr. Mays, I had spiced it up a little bit. But out of some sort of subconscious respect for my former teacher, I went straight to the version that he told my class in my sophomore year of high school. The group enjoyed my stories for the most part, the showers being the mutual favorite among the partygoers. Steve and I left for the cabin at around 5 in the morning, and he asked me about that story on the drive home. I told him all about Mr. Mays, that class, my love for everything horror-related and whatnot. He suggested we try to find the place on our return trip to New York. Initially, I was reluctant, simply because I didn't feel like aimlessly wandering through Nebraska for days, looking for some old farm building that was probably demolished at this point. But a couple of days before we left Colorado, I told Steve that it sounded like fun. We weren't going to be able to do another trip like this for a long time, so I figured we might as well make the best out of it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought of it as a little tribute to Mr. Mays, a guy that, in retrospect, helped me realize I wanted to be a writer. Anyway, we left Colorado and made the long, boring, and barren drive to Broken Bow, Nebraska, or Hell on Earth, as Mr. Mays had put it. We found a motel in town and hung around for a couple of days, venturing out 100 miles or so in any given direction each day after that. I had remembered Mr. Mays telling us it was somewhere outside of Broken Bow, but I don't think he got any more specific than that. We tried asking the townsfolk if they had any information about the showers, but we were usually met with blank stares or eye-rolling when we told them exactly what the place was. The only person who seemed to know anything about it was an older lady that worked at a gas station on the outskirts of town. I don't recall her name, but this woman was one of those cheerful old people, very helpful and generally interested in what anyone had to say. Steve had started talking to her at the checkout, and she asked about our license plate, commenting about the fact that we were very far from home. We had nowhere in particular to be, so Steve and I ended up talking to this woman for about 15 minutes, at which point we brought up our hunt for the place known as the Showers. Initially, the name didn't ring any bells with the woman, which made sense, seeing as Mr. Mays had just given it the name after his experience. But when I began to describe the details that I remembered from his story, the friendly old woman interrupted me. Her tone was not scornful or mean by any way, but she became very terse and deliberate with her words from that point on. People don't deal with anything relating to that sort of business around here anymore. she told us. That was all a long time ago. Following her statements, she attempted to be cheerful again, excusing herself to the restroom and wishing us best on our trip to New York. Steve and I returned to the car without another word. Both of us were thinking about what the lady had said. Again, she didn't seem to be angry at all. She just didn't want to have to hear another word about it. We were driving back to the hotel before Steve said something. I mean, if I had to live in a place associated with an urban legend or something like that, I would totally mess with anyone who asked about it, he said. I mean, eventually you'd just get tired of people asking about it, so you'd try and scare them to get them to shut up, wouldn't you? I agreed with Steve, and I kept driving. But the whole experience wasn't sitting right with me. If this was some sort of well-known legend in the area, why did no one else in the town seem to know anything about it? But I managed to shrug it off. Mind you, neither of us was scared of finding the showers. This little excursion on our road trip was more like a scavenger hunt, a cap-off to an overall relaxing vacation. Steve and I were basically like tourists, hunting for the site at which a famous movie was filmed or something dumb like that. We went into the whole situation with little to no expectations and a fleeting hope that we would be able to find this place. We spent another day in Broken Bow before we took our trip out to try and find the showers. Nebraska isn't as terrible of a place as people make it out to be, but it isn't really all that exciting. We found a bar and spent some time there, and that was just about the extent of our activity on our day off. When we did get back on the road, we decided we would attempt to stay off main roads for as much of the day as possible. I knew that there was no way this place was going to be off the highway road, and I remember some detail about a dirt road in Mr. May's story, so we went looking for those. This was a fairly futile effort, as most of Nebraska is dirt roads. It was like 7 in the evening when we came upon a small but thick forest. I use the term lightly, but for Nebraska, this place was like an oasis. Trees were full and thick, shrouding most of its insides in darkness. The sun was setting, and even though we had run into a few of these random crops of trees, we agreed that this one showed more promise than any of the others. There wasn't really a road, but there looked to be a path where a dirt road might have been at some point, so we drove along that. If this car was able to handle the Rocky Mountains, a dirt path in Nebraska would give us no trouble. We moved slowly and carefully along this trail, making sure to clear any fallen trees in the road or rocks that would render the car useless. When the sun finished setting, it was pretty dark. And it was pretty dark in this place during the day, but when night came, it was something else entirely. I had an inkling at this point that we had found the right place, but I didn't want to jinx it, so we just continued onward. I didn't realize it at the time, but the little bits of light that had managed to penetrate the canopy in this miniature forest actually did make it look as if the tree branches were trying to grab the car, just like Mr. Mays had mentioned in the story. I'm still convinced that he made up the part about animal eyes, though. The most aggressive creature we saw in the woods was a dead rabbit on the side of the trail. It didn't have any obvious signs of death either. It looked like it simply laid down and, well, never bothered to get up. We drove around in the darkness for quite a while before we found a clearing. We had to move several small clusters of branches out of the way before, but right in front of our exit was this giant, dead monster of a tree. So we got out and turned on the bright headlights in hopes that we would illuminate the area in front of us, because there was no way we were moving this one. There was a feeling of excitement mixed strangely with fear when I saw what lay 50 feet beyond the clearing. There, lit partially by the headlights from the car and the little bit of light from the crescent moon, was what appeared to be an old barn house. This wasn't a typical farmhouse. It was larger than the barns I had seen in films, and didn't have any sort of crest. It basically looked like a small warehouse. I wasn't entirely sure at this point if this was the place we were looking for, but this was definitely the closest we had come. I moved through the brush until I was roughly 20 feet from the entrance, at which point all of the growth seemed to stop. I don't know if the owners had done something to the soil, but the whole structure had a border around it that was clear of any sort of plant life. I approached the entrance to the building, a large sliding door, as Steve came up behind with 2 flashlights in hand. "So you were just going to run off into that place in the dark?" He laughed. I gave a half-hearted chuckle and grabbed one of the lights from his hand. Mine was a small but pretty bright flashlight. It was the kind that hikers would most likely fasten to their backpacks, just in case they were stranded at night. It worked well enough. I grabbed the metal door with both hands, holding the flashlight with my mouth, and I gave it a tug. It moved, slightly creaked a little bit, but there was no way I was doing this by myself. Steve came up from behind, set his flashlight on the ground, grabbed the door, and said 1, 2, 3. We pulled at the door with all we could muster. Once we had managed to move it a couple of inches, it must have latched back onto its tracks because it slid very easily, stopping hard with a loud and echoing thud when it was completely open. Steve picked up his flashlight and walked behind me. I'd already moved inside. The inside of the structure was exceptionally bare, almost troublingly so. I wasn't entirely sure how far we were from the nearest home or small town, but there wasn't even the slightest bit of evidence that anyone had been in this building for years. There were no broken beer bottles or empty bags of chips. There weren't even any animal droppings or eager plants that had managed to grow here. The room was expansive, larger than your average farm, but not the warehouse-sized monstrosity I believed Mr. Mays had described in his story. I was sure that it was simply a holding area for farming equipment or something similar at some point. Disappointed, I wandered near the entrance while Steve ventured into the expanse of darkness. I was running over the details of the story in my mind, and something struck me like a sack of bricks. In Mr. May's story, there was a silo near the barn. I ran outside, my eyes adjusting easily, because at the very least it was brighter outside. I looked in all directions, running around the perimeter of the building. Surely, if there was ever a silo near this place, there would be some kind of evidence of it somewhere. But despite my hopes, there was nothing but a cluster of thick bushes on one side, brush and dirt everywhere, and the forest we had come from. I walked back into the building, frustrated and tired. Steve was still excited, eagerly running around the inside of the building. "Even if I could just find a shower head or a pipe," he said, "then we'd know it was true. Just keep looking with me." I didn't want to ruin his excitement. I had told Steve the story several times, but obviously he didn't realize that this just wasn't the place. The building was weird, yes. It was out of place and oddly pristine, but it wasn't the location of the showers. I let him explore for a little bit before I called him over. "Hey, this is probably as close as we're gonna get, man," I said. "But this isn't it. Remember the silo?" His face went from excitement to disappointment in an instant, much like a young child who didn't get the presents he wanted on his birthday. I patted him on the shoulder. "This is still pretty cool, though. I mean, we could still tell people that we found it." I was reverting back to old habits quickly. Steve laughed. "Yeah, man, I guess we could. It is definitely creepy enough. We should get some pictures as proof, you know?" I agreed with him. "I'm gonna go grab the camera really quick," he said as he bolted out of the entrance of the building. I was left alone in the building. It was very quiet when I was alone in there. I could hear the faint sound of Steve running through the brush into the car, but once he was far enough away, everything was quiet. I remember not even hearing wind or the chirping of crickets as I walked deeper into the dark, flashlight in hand. I was convinced there had to be something. As I approached the far corner of the room, the sound of my feet scratching against the dirt was interrupted by a soft, hollow thud. I stopped, trying to figure out what it was. I put my foot down hard against the ground and I heard it again. I stomped one more time, realizing that the floor I was standing on was covering something hollow. I walked to the wall of the room, looking carefully at the floor, trying to spot any holes or gaps. As far as I'd known, it was solid ground that this thing sat atop, so I was convinced I had found a hatch or a basement or something. I heard Steve coming back through the brush, and I shouted, "Steve, come over here, it's hollow!" As I went to say the word hollow, I hopped a bit, hoping to recreate the sound so he would be able to hear it upon entering the door. The second my feet made contact with the floor, I felt it give out beneath me. The memory of the fall was fuzzy, but I do recall hearing wood splinter. I remember seeing the light from Steve's flashlight falling away into complete darkness. It wasn't a long fall, but I must have fallen in a terrible position, because I know I lost consciousness for several seconds at least. For an instant, when I woke up, I was staring at a bright light. For an instant, I had thoughts about approaching the fabled light at the end of the tunnel. I was angry at myself. "You died in Nebraska, Jack? Wow, you do know how to fuck off." My self-deprecation in the afterlife was interrupted by what sounded like Steve's voice. "Jesus, Jack! Jack, can you hear me? Dude, wake up! Please wake up." I managed to lift my head off the floor just enough for him to celebrate. The pain in my head was immense, but it was outweighed by the pain shooting through my knee. I knew I had a concussion, but the pain in my knee was so much more pressing. I looked around until I found my tiny flashlight, then sat up, reassured Steve. "I'm okay, I just hurt my knee. I bumped my head too. Really hard." "Thank fuck, man. I thought you were dead." Imagine that, though. Dying in fucking Nebraska? That'd be awful. His words made me laugh a bit, but I stopped myself. The slightest shaking hurt my head and made me incredibly dizzy. "I guess a rope," said Steve. "What?" I asked quietly. "Should I go get a rope to get you out of here? Or do you see a ladder?" I looked around the walls that sat in front of me. They were smooth cement. There was no way I was climbing out of here. "Yeah, get the rope," I told him. "It's buried under all of our stuff. I think it might be in my red climbing bag, but I'm not sure." Steve nodded, telling me to hang in there and that he would be back in a little bit, and then he ran off. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. After the sound of Steve's feet scraping the floor above me faded away, I was only able to hear that buzzing that occurs in total silence, intertwined with the pulsing in my head. I pushed myself over to the nearest cement wall and braced myself against it, resting and breathing deep in an attempt to calm myself. The cement was unnaturally cold against my back. It was summer, so I only had a t-shirt on, but it felt like ice even through that. Again, this observation was primarily made after the fact. In the moment, it just felt good to lean against something. I sat there, waiting for Steve in this underground basement, and I began to feel uneasy. I felt like an idiot for falling down here. I felt the pain from my injuries as well. That all seemed to fade into one emotion in an instant, when I heard what I could only identify as breathing somewhere to my left. I convinced myself that it was my injured mind playing tricks on me for a few moments, until my mind decided to rapidly replay Mr. May's story. When I first heard it in that classroom years before, I was more impressed than I was scared. But now, sitting in a dark basement in the middle of Nebraska, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. It couldn't even be summed up in the word fear. As I sat there, I felt all-encompassing dread. I pointed my flashlight to the left, the direction from which I thought I heard the sound. The light didn't reach the other wall, and it was too far away. But I was comforted to see there was absolutely nothing there. I breathed deeply for a couple more seconds before I heard another noise in the darkness. It was very quick, and I cannot be sure that it wasn't my own body moving around without my noticing. But I thought that I heard a scraping sound, and not 10 feet in front of me. It sounded like the noise your feet make when you're walking across a dirt-covered floor. Before I could react, I heard the breathing to my left again, closer this time. There was no way this was real. I hadn't seen as much as a spider web in this building, and now I'm convincing myself that something next to me was breathing. I was angry at myself for getting so worked up. I told myself the human brain is constantly hallucinating. I told myself that while in silence or darkness, the brain will make sounds to fill the gap, or make you think you see things that aren't there. I channeled my inner skeptic in order to calm myself, and it worked. It worked until I saw a flash of something in front of me. I can't be entirely sure what it was, but I heard the accompanying sounds of feet scraping against the floor, and I began to swell with dread. I decided that the best course of action at this point was to turn off my flashlight, assuming that if they couldn't see me, they couldn't get to me, whatever they might be. I turned off my flashlight and was left in complete and total darkness. The bulb from the flashlight faded and cooled as soon as I put it into my pocket, simultaneously pushing back against the cold cement wall in an attempt to stand. I managed to get up on my feet, foot, and found that I couldn't stand or put any pressure on my injured knee. I limped to the corner, humming to myself, trying to break the deafening silence. I called for Steve as loud as I could manage, but I heard no response. He was probably in the back of the car, still hunting for the rope. There had to be a ladder or something somewhere. I continued to hum, and my heartbeat, which had been beating almost out of my chest, slowed to a manageable rate. I moved along the cement wall, keeping my whole body against it and the weight off of my injured knee. I had traveled what I guessed to be about 10 feet when my head made contact with something in front of me, and I tumbled to the ground. My concussion must have amplified the pain because it was blinding. I reached both hands to my forehead, and I felt something warm and wet with my fingers. I searched for a cut anywhere on my forehead, but I couldn't find one. I desperately searched for my flashlight as I sat up and tried to get back against the wall. I grabbed the light with my right hand, bracing against the wall with the other. I turned it on and pointed to the darkness where I was just lying. The floor was wet, but the dirt had muddled the color of whatever the liquid was. I tried to get my eyes to focus on the puddle, tried to convince myself that it was my blood, when I saw another drop fall into the puddle. Words lack the ability to describe the way I felt when I heard the drip noise again, and I saw another tiny ball of liquid fall into the puddle. I think I knew even then exactly what the source was, but I was endlessly trying to convince myself that I was wrong. I lifted the flashlight up and pointed it at the source of the liquid. What stared back at me was a pipe. A pipe that protruded at least a foot from the cement wall. The metal was rusted and cracked. Little bits of the liquid began to seep from them, and at the end of the pipe was a simple shower head aimed down towards the ground. You know that feeling when your stomach drops? In this case, I think mine literally did, because I vomited immediately. It got all over my shoe, but that wasn't the least bit important to me at the time. I ignored the pain in my knee and shuffled along the wall as fast as I possibly could. I heard noises, but I can't be sure if it was just the sounds of my own movement or something around me. I managed to duck under the next shower head, this one higher up on the wall, and seemed to be leaking out the same liquid that the other one was. I felt like I was moving along something infinite. Every now and then, I would have to duck or move under another metal bar, another shower head. They began to pour more profusely, but the liquid was too thick to come out easily. The room began to smell, and I remembered immediately the way Mr. Mays described it. I grabbed my shirt, put it over my nose, and kept trucking onward, but it didn't stop the smell for an instant. It smelled like vomit. It smelled like shit. It smelled like burnt hair. It smelled like rot. I was still moving against the wall when I fell into some sort of outlet. I hit the dirt ground hard, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The pain still managed to break through, though. My flashlight still in my hand, I aimed it and examined my surroundings. Sitting in front of me was a doorway. There was a door there, though it looked aged now. It had a nice little design on it, a doorknob and a knocker that looked like a snarling demon. Red paint was peeling from it, flaking off and falling to the ground in front of me. I clumsily rose and busted through the door, narrowly missing a hanging piece of sheet metal in front of me. I was crawling now. There was no way I could run. The walls and ceilings were lined with metal, the kind that you would see on the roof of a farm. Large pieces of wood seemed to brace the sheets, holding this makeshift tunnel together. I couldn't risk sliding against that and possibly cutting myself on the metal or hitting the wood and causing a cave-in. So I crawled. I pulled myself for what felt like miles, running into walls every now and then because the path seemed to curve like a snake. I had no idea where I was in relation to the hole that I had fallen through, but I told myself there was an exit at the end of this. Had I not been crawling, I would have surely hurt myself far worse. There were parts of the tunnel in which the ceiling dipped down to maybe 3 feet above the ground. It hadn't caved in because the ceiling still lined it. Someone had built this. This, again, is in hindsight. I didn't care at the time. I kept telling myself there was nothing behind me, but I swore I heard feet scraping only a few inches behind my own. My feet would brush against my legs every now and then, making it feel like something was touching me. And even now, I still can't completely convince myself that someone wasn't. I crawled and crawled until I reached an upslope. With joy, I looked ahead of me, and there was a cellar door. The door was made of wood. I knew this because I could see light through them. I couldn't be sure, but I thought it might have been the light from the car's headlights. Besides all that, I was just so immensely happy to find an exit. I crawled all the way to the door and threw my shoulder into it. It budged, but it didn't open. I began to scream, but my throat seared with pain. The most I could manage was a harsh crying noise. I collapsed in exhaustion and pain, my eyes staring up at the slits of light before me. I was so close to being out of here. I could taste it. It was in that moment of silent defeat that I heard a noise that was, without question, something moving in the tunnel. It sounded like something was being dragged across the floor. It would move, pause for a second, and then move again. I had nothing left in my stomach to throw up, but I began to gag. I gathered myself slightly and tried to steady my hand enough to focus the flashlight into the tunnel. What I saw, I still cannot rationalize. I know what I saw, but I can't convince myself it was actually there. I can't stop telling myself that I was hallucinating. I saw a child in a dirty sleeping gown. The gown was stained with something dark and brown with occasional splashes of deep red. The child was extremely frail, like the pictures that people might see of a Holocaust victim. I could only make out one eye, brightly reflecting the light of my flashlight. Between huge tufts of long, dirty hair. It reached down beyond the fingertips of the child, which were caked with dirt. The boy or girl, I'm not entirely sure which, moved towards me with difficulty. It wasn't breathing hard, but it seemed that every movement of every muscle took every ounce of strength the child had. The thing that froze me, though, was the eye. It was only visible because it was reflecting my flashlight, but even in that glint, I could feel anger, or deep hatred, or something like it. This is the point in which the English language really lacks the right words to explain the situation. I could tell that this child wished me harm. Whether it was a hallucination or not, it was getting closer. I started to cry. It was getting closer and closer when I heard the voice from behind me. "Hey, Jack," whispered the voice. It was Steve. I was certain. I tried to talk back, fully intending to say, "Open this up and get me out right now." However, given my current state, I'm sure it sounded like garbled nonsense. I clawed at the door, pushing against it with everything I had, and finally breaking eye contact with the child. As I did this, the flashlight rolled down the slope, coming to rest somewhere near the child's feet. "What do you see?" the voice asked. What are you talking about? I remember hearing a reply along the lines of, "Just look at it. Tell me what you see." But my own screams of frustration drowned it out. I was mumbling like a maniac when the voice told me calmly, "Rest for a second, I'll get it." The statement took a second to settle in, at which point I closed my eyes tight. "Steve, just do it, please. Please get it open, please," I whimpered. "Just get me out of here." My voice was beginning to get louder. "Steve, goddammit, open the fucking wooden door." I opened my eyes for just a split second to see nothing but black hair dangling in front of my face, a small glint of light hidden in the mess of tangles. I slammed my eyes shut and screamed with every ounce of energy I had, "Open the fucking door!" The door behind me gave way, and I fell onto the dirt, taking in a breath of fresh air. Once I had done that, I took a deep breath and opened my eyes. I saw the barn in front of me, illuminated by the headlights of the car. My head was pulsing with a pain. I was covered in dirt and liquids that I didn't even care to know the origin of. My knee was at the very least dislocated, but despite all of that, I was out of the tunnel. I took a deep breath, buried my head in my hands, and said, "Steve, why didn't you just fucking open the door?" I waited for a response, but none came. "Steve, seriously," I began. "I was fucking clawing, screaming for my life," I said as I looked behind me. My stomach must have been on the verge of falling out of me at this point because it shifted again. The only thing behind me was the large mass of bushes I had seen while examining the perimeter of the building. I was angry. "Steve, this is not the fucking time. Come out of the fucking bushes." I was getting ready to stand up when I heard a yell from the front of the building. A flashlight bobbed up and down in the semi-darkness. Steve was running to the open door of the structure, yelling my name, telling me not to worry. I must have lost consciousness at that point. When I woke up, Steve was standing over me, desperately trying to wake me up. His words were almost incoherent, at least to my ears. He helped me to my feet and began to walk me to the car. As we walked away, I saw my flashlight sitting just outside the cellar door. The light was fading. Steve brought me back to the car and then drove me to the nearest hospital. I fell asleep, but he told me that he drove around an hour before he found a main road. I don't think I ever told him the whole story. I believe he thinks I was just injured from the fall. He never really asked about it, and we didn't stay in contact for much longer. It's not like we deliberately parted ways. We just sort of stopped hanging out after that trip and went our separate ways. I've never been able to fully understand what happened that night. There are many things I can explain away as being hallucinations, but there are still many things that don't make sense. The shower heads were there, and they were leaking something. The door was real. The tunnel was real. Most everything else can be semi-rationalized if I convince myself that I had a very bad concussion. A very, very bad concussion. But the one thing I can't have imagined was that cellar door was locked, and then suddenly it wasn't. I'm still as skeptical as I have ever been, but I believe in what happened to me at the showers. I'm not a hermit or a social outcast because of this. I drink a lot, but I'm still functional. But I will never return to Nebraska. No one will ever be able to convince me otherwise. I don't watch horror movies either. There's absolutely nothing entertaining about being desperately scared. That's it, really. There's no typical ending for my story. I was changed by my experience, yeah. But there's no way for me to change anything about it or fight back against it. I can't even convince myself that I wasn't just seeing things. Believe me, I've been trying for years. Prior to this, there was really no way to find any information on the showers. The legend didn't exist outside of the classroom of Mr. Mays. No one told stories like this to keep children away from a certain place, or to scare them. It wasn't known. I guess that's really the point of this whole story. I want people to know, firsthand, what this place is like. Maybe it's a drunk's rationale, or the kid inside me wanting to spread these kinds of stories again. I don't know. I don't care. But it's out there now. For people to mold and warp to their needs. Most importantly, it's finally out of my head. It's getting late, and I need another drink. Cheers. Alright, guys. I'm going to take a 15-minute break. And when I come back, we will be starting up again with some more r/paranormal stories. So sit tight, stay tuned, and I will see you guys momentarily. My name is Leo, and welcome to another Sleepless Night. Tonight, we're going to be finishing out with a few stories from r/Paranormal. These stories are going to be shorter than the ones we've read from r/NoSleep. However, I believe you'll enjoy them all the same. Just a reminder before we begin, if you have any stories of your own that you would like me to read, be sure to visit my r/Sleepless Nights subreddit. As you can see in the bottom corner, there's r/sleepless_nights. There you can post stories that you want me to read, as well as fan artwork, music, etc. Also remember that if you really enjoy these stories, and if you enjoy hearing my podcasts, or my videos in general, make sure to subscribe so you're always up to date on any time I post a new story or go live with another podcast. Without further ado, let's begin our first story. This one is titled, I Died Once, and Here's My Experience. In 2012, I suffered a stroke that killed me. As I slipped away, I had felt an overwhelming peace come over me, like I'd never felt before. Things went black, and then I was ascending above, and saw the city below. Next to me, I heard a voice from this orb of varied color lights, that also had a mist coming off of it. It was a woman's voice, and she was telling me how excited she was to finally be with her family and see her mom and dad again. I started to feel unsure, and I told her I wasn't supposed to be here. Suddenly, I was standing in another worldly place that was gorgeous. All the structures and buildings were made of what looked similar to marble, but had an iridescent color between the marbling. The buildings were decorated with colorful stones with gold embezzlements lining the buildings and glass fencing. I walked along the path with my arms crossed and holding to my body. I felt lost, and everyone around me was chattering happily with each other in these otherworldly clothes of satin-like linens. Some people held hands and were close and joyful with each other. The place was absolutely beautiful. I came upon an old man who was sitting near a tree and seemed to be teaching a class with people surrounding him. Some were sitting and others were standing. He called me over to join him. He was teaching the lessons of what life was supposed to be like on Earth, what it was originally supposed to be, and how humans were supposed to be caring for the world and the inhabitants on it. But materialism had gotten in the way, among other things. I felt an overwhelming knowledge come over me as he continued to teach this class about the world, the universe, life, and death. Everyone began to surround me, and the old man put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "It's not your time yet. You will know when it is." The people from the class all came in and held me in a circle, and I was suddenly back. I opened my eyes and breathed in. I was alive and back in my body. This is how I came to believe in God, and also reincarnation. I don't claim a religion because my beliefs are now a mix of things. Unfortunately, slowly that knowledge was instilled into me, slowly slipped away over the years, but I feel it in the back of my mind. To me, religion became several fingers pointing to the same being. I don't need a religion to dictate my relationship with God. If you're all wondering, I'm 27 now and suffer residual effects that have disabled me, but I keep going. My body may not work properly, but my brain does, and I still focus on expanding my knowledge in various areas. Also, for those of you who are familiar with these subreddits. These r/NoSleep is a place where people can get together and share horror stories, whether they're true or not. All stories are treated as true and are not debunked or removed unless they are, very blatantly going against the rules. Here on r/Paranormal, these are all stories that are supposedly true. Here we go. This is another one that I wanted to read. So I saw this about 4 years ago at work, and it creeped me the fuck out. I work for a digital surveillance company that runs the eye in the sky for thousands of restaurants, bars, and gas stations across the U.S. From time to time, we get a call for investigations to look into robberies, theft, etc. So one day we get a call from a popular fast food chain located in the heart of Detroit. They say an employee OD'd by the dumpster and they needed us to get some answers on the situation. First, basically what happened and how long was he there. The next question is where it starts to get weird. See, the dumpster had a brick wall around it. It had 2 entrances to the dumpster, a gate you had to pass when you walked out the back door, and the big gates where the garbage truck has access to the dumpster to empty it out. They claimed those big gates were always open and the small gate by the back door was locked from the inside. No one ever used the smaller gate. The weird thing was, when the body was found, an employee walked out. That gate was never open, but this time it was. And the body was sitting there on full display. So their next question was, who the fuck opened that gate? So we download the footage. One night, the employee goes outside, throws out the trash, and you can kind of see him through the locked gate that was never open. It was see-through, but also very difficult to see through. The way the camera was angled, you could kind of see over the top also. He injects himself, slumps over, and keels over dead behind the dumpster. He was out there for 2.5 days. No employees ever came to look for him. It's pouring rain both days. For 2 days, employees come and go, taking out the trash and not seeing him. Then, on the 3rd day, in the morning sunshine, clear as fucking day, the gate just slowly opens by itself. Nobody comes, nobody goes. The gate just fucking opens by itself, and the body is sitting there in the same position it was 2.5 days earlier. I literally felt chills down my spine. To this day, I can't explain it without thinking it was paranormal. Anyways, a couple hours later, an employee walks out with a trash bag, sees the body, freaks out, calls the police. I didn't write it, but we basically had to write a report on how a gate apparently opened itself. I'm going to go ahead and find a couple more stories from r/Paranormal, and then I'm going to finish out with this channel's all-time favorite, r/Let's Not Meet. I'm a sheriff's deputy in a fairly busy county, so we see and hear strange things all the time, but this gives me the chills. There's an abandoned house in a rural area of the county that sits a good ways back into the woods. Every so often, our dispatch will receive a 911 call from a landline at the residence with nothing but white noise. The dispatchers ask if anyone is there, but they never get an answer. Since it's an open 911 call and we know the address, we have to respond, and every time we do, there's no one there. The oddest thing is, there's no electricity or any signs of wiring going to the house. Every deputy that's been there gets a feeling of dread just being on the property. I'm not sure the history of the house, so I don't know what could be there. Any thoughts on what it could be? Edit. I'm working in the zone of this house tonight, so I'll try and go by and snap a photo if I can. Update. On the way out to the property, I found a vehicle driving on the wrong side of the road. So I'm at the jail finishing paperwork on the DWI. I'll post the picture as soon as I can. And here is an update with photos for verification. I'll see if I can pull up a display so you guys can see exactly what this photo looks like. Because we always love a little bit of evidence. It appears my display capture is not working. So, here's what I will do. Because I would like you guys to see no, damn, that's not what I meant to click. Here we go. I'll add an image. The pictures. And there it is. So this here, my friends, oops, let me scale that down to size so y'all can see it. This is a picture of the house, in which was, oh my god, it was a huge picture. There we go. This right here is a picture of the house that our officer friend here was talking about. And update 2 part of the story. To preface this part of the account, I consider myself to be pretty rational when it comes to odd situations, but I am open to the idea of paranormal activity. I have posted here because this is one of those cases I felt you all would enjoy on the sub, and to see if anyone might have any possible explanations or similar instances. Apparently there are a few stories out there similar to mine. Not in it for the karma, just an interesting story I wanted to share. Anyways, this was my first time walking up to this place, so it was definitely an experience. The trail is gated off, so I had to walk by it. It's about 200 yards back into the woods, through a very dense brush and trees. There was nearly zero loom on the trail, and I really had to watch my step, even with my flashlight. I jumped a deer on the way up, and it scared the living hell out of me. Once I turned the corner at the end of the trail and saw the house, my heart started racing, and I honestly felt like something was there with me. I started messing with my flashlight, phone, and notepad to try and get a good photo of the verification with the house when I felt that I needed to leave. It wasn't a feeling of I shouldn't be here, but more of a you need to get the fuck out of Dodge now. Having been in a very stressful situation in the past, I've learned to trust that feeling. I got the best photos I could and walked all the way back down the trail towards my car. I'm almost embarrassed to say that I legitimately felt something was following me. I made it back to the car and sat with my spotlight pointed at the trailhead, waiting to see if something would come out of the woods. Fortunately, nothing did. I sat for a minute and caught my breath while I reviewed the photos, hoping what I got was sufficient, because I did not want to go back. I'm about to go off duty, so this is it for today. I'm really interested in what the hell happened to this place. I plan to do some research tomorrow. And here he was able to obtain a few recordings of the calls from the house. And I will play those for you now. I'm going to pause my music real quick so you guys get an idea of what the hell's going on here. So this call 1 is just going to be a short clip with white noise. Sure which one that is. Call 2 is a longer clip with white noise. You can hear the dispatcher saying hello, but I wasn't able to hear it. So that's just the general idea of what they all are. You can hear the dispatcher talking in the background in that one. Definitely creepy to say the least. Not a call I'd want to get. I've been doing some research between calls tonight and I found some history on the property. The house was built in 1890 and the first deed on file was registered in 1901. The property has since been in possession of the same family that owns it today. From what I could find, the current owners of the property live out of state now, but had previously either lived in the house or on the property some years back. The area it's in was a boom town during the late 1800s, but fizzled out shortly afterwards due to lack of profits from the mines. Other than that, I haven't found anything that makes the property stand out. On a more speculative note, the house sits close to an area where a Native American tribe used to reside. I'll dig deeper into the history of the property and the family and see what I can find out. Sorry for the lack of updates. I've been spending time with family the past couple days and I haven't gotten much done. I have the name of the person who has the deed to the property, but contacting them has been a bit of a task. I plan to go back to the house tomorrow during the day. Some more photos will follow. And here is a new post with an entirely different update. Oh. That's upsetting. It's been removed. But understandable. Happens sometimes. But either way, that's something I've always found to be incredibly creepy, and something that I will never envy of those who have to work the 911 dispatch and first responders. Because it is very easy for my mind to wander to a situation in which I have to get called to a house that ends up being abandoned, derelict, haunted, or any other terrifying amalgamation of paranormal or otherwise ideas that my mind can formulate. Give me 1 second. And here is one more from r/paranormal that we'll read before we switch to this channel's favorite subreddit and switch on over to r/let's not meet for some stories about stalkers, predators, and other just generally scary people. Last week of July last year, I went to Ocean City, Maryland with my boyfriend at the time. The first few nights were great. I got to see a longtime friend who lives there, and he was tagging along with us the night it happened. My boyfriend and my friend decided they wanted to go get crab fries. I wasn't interested because I just don't like Old Bay on fries. I'm sorry, sue me. So I decided to sit on a bench and wait for them. I saw a family go by, and I saw their daughter walking behind them. She looked really mad and was texting quickly as if she was in a really heated argument. She had short bleached white hair and really sick tattoos. That's what made her stand out to me. Her tattoos. They were awesome. So anyways, my boyfriend and friend came back over, and we walked behind that family for a while. We ended up getting distracted by the boardwalk performers, and I lost sight of them. I didn't think anything of it, though. Around 2 a.m., we were some of the only people on the boardwalk besides the small groups of drunk teenagers smoking cigarettes and yelling. And I saw her again, running towards the beach, crying. I wanted to go after her and ask if she was okay, but my boyfriend advised me to just stay out of it and keep going. We went to our hotel, and we fell asleep. At about 6 a.m., I got up and rolled a joint and quietly left the room. The hotel we were staying at had a nice sitting area out front looking over the ocean. I admired the view for a few minutes when I noticed her again. She was walking down the boardwalk looking confused and scared. She was crying still. I get this weird gut feeling to follow her. I tucked my joint into my clutch and followed a little bit behind her. She looked nervous and was looking left and right as if she was lost. I followed her all the way to the 2nd Street beach ramp. Suddenly, she bursted into a full sprint, crying hysterically. I don't know why, but I shouted, "Hey, wait! Do you need help?" I ran to the beach and just stood in shock. Nobody was there, but I could hear soft sobbing nearby to the right of me. I walked down the beach a little ways before I saw it. Where the sobbing sounds had led me, there was an arm sticking out from the sand. It was her arm. It was her tattoos. I'll never forget them. The sobbing stopped, and suddenly the ambient noises of the beach became louder again. I didn't notice at the time, but the whole time I was following her and following the crying, everything else was completely silent. When I realized what I was looking at, I screamed for someone to call 911. A middle-aged couple came jogging up. The wife screamed and the husband dialed them right away. I didn't have my phone with me, as I don't like when sand ends up in my charging port. The police arrived a little while later. When they took my statement, I didn't even know what to tell them. I just said I had been walking down the beach and I just found her. It took them hours to dig her out. When they finally started to pull her out, they asked that all civilians and witnesses be led away. As we were walking with the police to a nearby spot to answer more questions, I saw her standing behind them, looking down at her own body. She looked up at me, nodded, and then she was gone. Initially, the reports all said that she sat in the hole and it collapsed around her, but it was later discovered that the big sand cleaners may have pushed the sand into the hole by mistake. But here's where it gets scary. She'd been missing since 2 a.m. She died somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m., and yet I saw her and followed her. The entire time I swear she looked real. I still have dreams about her, and I have never forgotten a single detail. That one was actually surprisingly heavy. Wow. Alright. I hope you're all enjoying, and I hope my crappy computer isn't making audio too laggy. If it is, I apologize. However, we're going to change gears, and we're going to switch on over to, as I've said again, this channel's favorite subreddit, just based on the videos that I've posted that you guys have enjoyed. We're switching to r/Let's Not Meet. I've been reading people's stories on here for a while now, and it encouraged me to share my own. I have other stories, both previous to this one, and more recent, that I may post later if you guys are interested. At the time this took place, I was 12 years old. My parents always kept an eye on me and my brothers, and always warned us to stay close to them when we were young, and if anyone ever made us uncomfortable at all, to tell them straight away. Now, since this encounter, I've been paranoid about keeping myself safe and staying away from creeps. But at that age, I was very shy and quiet. I often hid behind my mom's skirt, and even though I was aware, I felt completely safe and didn't often think about running into people of the hair-raising nature. This encounter changed my way of thinking. I was homeschooled, and my little brother was homeschooled too. My parents went grocery shopping once every week. My little brother and I would accompany them, mostly to get out of the house, and for the opportunity to maybe get some fast food for lunch. On such trips to the shops, we basically finished filling our trolley with groceries and were ready to pay. Mom had realized we had forgotten onions, so I volunteered to go fetch some. As I made my way down the aisle, I saw a dodgy-looking man pass me, but I didn't think much of him. As I proceeded to get closer to the checkout, I found the same man making small talk with my dad. I studied him when I got closer to my father. He looked about in his late 60s, with wisps of gray hair coming out of his mostly bald head, glasses, and a large mole under his left eye. I stood next to my dad, and the guy gave me a toothy smile and said something in which I assumed what sounded like French. With the most disgusting breath that I'm pretty sure killed the flowers behind me, and he started staring at my shirt. I didn't get it, but he repeated himself in English. "You like Paris, do you?" He pointed at my shirt, which had the Eiffel Tower printed on it. I guess. But I like this shirt. Oh, do you? Interesting. He said this, but kept switching glances between my face and shirt. Suddenly, my dad shoved me out the exit and hurried me into the parking lot. I didn't understand until my mom came out with my brother in tow. Dad told my mom that there was a weirdo in the store who kept staring at my boobs. Let me note that I didn't look any older than I was. Not that it would excuse his actions, but me being young, it made me uncomfortable. And I wasn't a young girl who got catcalled or anything, so I wasn't used to this kind of thing. And this man was old enough to be my grandfather. Next week we went shopping again, on the same day but at a later time. Parents and little bro made their way to the entrance, and I went to get a trolley from the trolley bay. The shop was on a 2-story building, on the 2nd floor, and I looked down to the 1st floor and saw the man directly underneath my position, his back to the wall and smoking. Then he turned to go to the stairs at my left and noticed me standing there. He stared back for a minute. Then he must have recognized me because he got an enormous smile on his face and started up the stairs, at which I hurried to find my family. I started down the first aisle and was relieved to see my mom at the end of the aisle, back turned. Alas, before I could reach her, I felt a hand brush against my butt, softly, but I still felt it through my jeans. He passed me and looked me dead in the eye. "Hi, girlie," he whispered, with the same flower-killing breath before rushing down the next aisle out of sight. I turned into the next aisle with my mom, and the man was standing shoulder to shoulder with my little brother, 7 at the time, observing him in a predatory manner. My big sister instincts kicked in, and I bolted to drag my little bro away from this wacko. He still followed us around the store, but kept his distance because my dad was nearby now. I still hadn't told my parents about the man, and when my mom told me to take little bro to look at the toys, I resisted, but reluctantly agreed after my mom gave me the mom look. As we looked at the toys, I kept my backside facing the basket/wall, thinking this would not allow him to grope me. As we went to leave the toy section, the man finds us, looking like he had just run a marathon around the shop. He picked out a teddy bear and approached us. "Hi," he said. I told little bro to run, and I was about to follow him when the man full-on cupped my butt and jiggled it. "So soft," he said. I let out a scream and bolted to my dad. Bawling, I told him everything, and Dad got extremely enraged. He stormed around the store looking for the sicko, but he'd already left. No one was told because I told my parents I just wanted to go home. In hindsight, we should have told the manager and the police. My advice to young girls and boys is to be aware. No matter how safe you feel, someone could still find a way. And if someone tries something, be loud, make a scene, and make people around you aware. And always tell someone, parents, friends, staff, etc. It took this to make me truly realize my surroundings, and it's horrible. Parents, please keep your kids safe. With creeps like this, you'll never know what they'll do. If I didn't have my parents to protect me, it could have gone down very differently. So to the sick bastard who thinks it's okay to touch and grab little kids, let's never meet again. I just moved to a new city. I had a few friends, but I still wanted to meet other people, and maybe a cute girl to date. I began using Tinder, which I had fun with in other cities. I matched with this gorgeous woman, way out of my league. Her profile was funny and interesting. We get to chatting, and she's flirtatious and clever, and let it drop she went to a top artsy school in France, so I'm intrigued. And also thinking, well, she's out of my league, why is she so interested? I decided to Google her, which is not something I used to do before every date. Usually this will bring up a Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, but when I clicked enter, her name came back with like 125,000 hits. News articles, videos, etc. Chronologically, the weirdness is this. As a teenager, she was one of those women to start up correspondence with serial killers and had been engaged to 2 on death row before they were put to death. Next, she was engaged to her 6th grade English teacher in her early 20s. He was famous for having falsely claimed to kill Jean Ron Bennett Ramsey. For this, she was on Good Morning America, saying he was going to use her to recruit 6th grade girls for a sex cult. Lastly, she became a high-end escort in this city, and had a fairly popular blog on it. In general, not shaming the sex worker community, but still was like sprinkles on the weirdness of this whole thing. After seeing these things, I was intrigued/creeped out by her, and found that she was the adopted daughter of a local billionaire. I decided this shit wasn't worth it and deleted Tinder the day before our date. The next day, she messaged me on another dating app, asking me if I was still going to meet her for a drink. No, let's not meet. Second. When I was about 6 years old, around 2004, my mom started taking me and my sister to Dr. Daniel's pediatric dental office. The dental center was located inside a giant yellow mansion that also doubled as Dr. Daniel's home. It was honestly gorgeous. When I first started going to the dentist, I was extremely shy and actually suffered from selective mutism and had a lot of autistic-like tendencies. Needless to say, I relied heavily on my mother's comfort for someone to give me a voice, because it was extremely anxious for me to walk up and talk to strangers, especially men for some reason. When my sister and I got called in from the waiting room, my mom followed us to the office until she was told by Dr. Daniels that parents were not allowed to be with their children, as it taught kids independence, to which my mom complied to. Once in there, he immediately separated my sister and I, and in reaction to that I cried because I felt so scared. Dr. Daniels did not like crying, so he grabbed me, put his hands over my mouth and nose, shook me, and aggressively warned me that if I continued to cry and scare the other kids, it would make my situation a lot worse. Obviously, this scared me even more, so I started to cry again. Dr. Daniels had enough and took me into his house part of the dentist office, where he screamed at me again, grabbed me by the neck, and shoved me. His hygienist, Judy, came over and told me if I continued to cry, she would spank me so hard I wouldn't know what had hit me. Afterwards, he gave me a juice concoction and left me alone in his house for another 5 minutes, until he took me back into the dental office and did work on my teeth. I guess I just instinctively knew that if I wanted to survive, I had to act like I wasn't terrified and hold on to the tears. All I wanted was my mom. After that first appointment with my sister and we told my mom that we were scared of the dentist and that he was mean, and she just took it as me being anxious, so we continued to see him. Each visit was just as terrifying. Every time we pulled into the mansion, my heart melted away inside my chest. I was so scared. It was no longer pretty to look at. Every time we went to the dentist, Dr. Daniels, or the Tooth Man as he called himself, always had us have heavy dental work procedures done. We had seals done on several baby teeth and plenty of teeth removed, some with his fingers, with no regards to pain level at all. And often, when having a tooth removal or seals done in your mouth, and had to be opened up, your mouth had to be opened up with a retractor, and he would leave us there with the retractor on for about 45 minutes or so before he came to work on our teeth. Sometimes he would eat his lunch while we sat there with our mouth open. Probably one of the worst pains I've ever felt in my life. I remember one time when I was in about 3rd grade, I had been leaned down in the chair waiting with the retractor on for an hour. I was in so much pain I couldn't stand it. I sat up on the chair and tried to scream and cry as loud as I could. Dr. Daniels came rushing over as angry as could be, took my retractors off, and took me back into his house part again, where he screamed at me for being a big baby and scaring all the other kids. I was so sad at myself because I hadn't cried in so long. He then took me back to the dental chair and pinned me down to my seat in a straitjacket. He put my retractors back on and said that I would have to wait even longer because I'd caused such a scene. All I could do was shed silent tears and drool everywhere, and I couldn't even wipe it because he locked up my arms. Afterwards, my mouth would become so swollen and filled with rashes. It hurt to talk for days. It would leave bruises and swells as soon as I left his chair. He would often tell my mother that I was a difficult patient if I so much as winced at his torture. Once he removed 6 of my teeth at once and I could barely eat. While he ripped out my teeth, he would often sing songs. It was so Sweeney Todd-like. When I was in 7th grade, I started getting some new braces, and we started seeing an orthodontist. Not long after that, we stopped seeing Dr. Dan and started seeing a new dentist, who was actually nice. I'd never known that getting your teeth cleaned didn't have to feel like going through a saw trap. I think my mom took us out of Dr. Dan's practice when the orthodontist looked at our dental records and saw a lot of unnecessary procedures being done on our mouths. Not long ago, I was having a conversation with a friend about our childhood fears, and instantly, my mind went to the Tooth Man. Curious, I googled him to see what had happened, and to my happiness, the practice was shut down. Also left under his name was a Yelp page that was still left up. The page was filled with numerous 1-star reviews from former patients that were once abused as kids in his office, using the page as an outlet to express their trauma. I started to cry because their experiences were so close and some identical as to what I went through when I was a kid. I was so sad, but at the same time, it was really validating to know that I was not alone. A lot of the procedures we went through were just a scam for him to collect money off of our parents' insurance. And now that I think about it, he's probably so adamant on us not crying and screaming for help because he didn't want parents to hear. And he didn't want them to come and try and see what was going on. I shake thinking about this. I really pray he hasn't opened up another practice somewhere else. I know it's hard not to blame the parents in this situation, but the truth is, this man was a swift abuser. For every bruise and swell we had, he would have dental explanations that would make the parents feel stupid for asking. He was an authority figure. I don't blame my mom for not believing in us. She knew he was firm, but probably thought we were confusing firmness with meanness. To be honest, even writing this, the torture was so wild it actually sounds made up. She eventually did come around. She's not alone, as there were hundreds and hundreds of parents that were duped and deceived by him. To Dr. Dan, please never let us meet again. And to any parent reading this, if you're ever told not to go in with your child to an appointment, something is really not right. Alright guys, I'd like to thank you all for joining me on this. I never took down the picture. Wow. I'd like to thank you for joining me tonight for this, my first podcast. I think it was relatively successful as we managed to get through quite a few really good stories. If you enjoyed, please make sure to subscribe to my channel, as you can get updates anytime I go live again or anytime I post a video to the channel. Feel free to leave me comments in this live stream or in another video, letting me know what stories would you like to hear more. Do you guys want to hear more creepypastas? Do you want to hear more NoSleep stories? Do you want to hear more Let's Not Meet? Let me know and I'll do what I can and see what kind of stories I can find. Other than that, I'd like to thank you all for joining me, and I will see you all another night. Good night, my insomniacs.